I think this collection is different to previous collections technically, in the sense that the reader will see that there are a lot of very short stories here, flash fiction. There are 2 stories, I think, which are hardly more than 2 sentences long. One of them is, I think if there are 100 words there, including the title, I'd be surprised. Partly that evolved from working on a blog, when I suddenly discovered that I could write very intense little epiphanic narratives or non-narratives in a very short space of time. Partly it evolved from the sense that you get as you grow older as a writer. You simply don't want to be limited anymore. You don't want to be limited even by something as apparently non-existent as length. If it takes me a paragraph to say it, well then why should I write any more than that paragraph? It becomes quite a thing with you to write it exactly the length that the material needs, and to cut your cloths to fit that. The prose in a very short piece has got to be a lot more intense, obviously, because it's carrying so much more weight. In 100 words, 1 word has to carry a lot of meaning. Whereas at 4,000, 5,000 words, you can afford to be a bit sloppier, as it were. So my idea was to simply not be limited, not to find myself in a situation where I was regulated by any of the typical publishing constraints, shall we say. There was no need to sell a very short story to anybody. There was indeed no need to please anybody with a very short story. I could write it for myself. But as I collected the stories together, I also realized there were various thematic connections between the short stories, the very short stories, and the longer ones. And so I thought, well, here we go. We can arrange the collections so that the the long-term shift of the themes from story to story is reflected in a kind of rhythm of long and short in the overall collection, in the collection itself. So what you have there is an attempt to organize it by rhythm rather than by content necessarily, although I think there are clear movements from thing to thing. 1 or 2 readers who've already read it have described it as being on the verge of being a novel, that the whole makes a single statement, which I think it does, and it's a statement. It's a complex statement, but it's really the one I've always made, which is to do with the necessity for escape and the constant failure to escape, the impossibility of escape, the impossibility of not trying to escape, as it were, from the situation in which we find ourselves. So that's why it's different. It was originally written to a prompt by a friend of mine who was doing 1,001 nights as an internet exercise. Her idea was to give an author precisely 12 hours to write to a prompt and then perform the piece immediately afterwards herself. And I wrote about, I think, 4 or 5 stories for her, most of which are in this collection. I think The Walls was, in a sense, the most successful. Again, it's about escape. It's about failing to realize you don't need to escape. But it's also about getting old. The the insistence upon counting the number of walls that he goes through, of course, leads to the figure 7, which is the old-fashioned 7 ages of man, as it were. And you can read it, if you like, as a metaphor for getting old and failing to realise that you never really needed to escape from your life. That's going to be handled for you. But it's also a political story in the sense that of many of the stories in this collection, which has themes of imprisonment, the failure of states, the increasing inhumanity that we face. I think each of the compartments that the central character enters could be considered to be in themselves states, as it were, not just states of aging, but states, geographical states. And it fits with a couple of the other shorter stories, which are set in the kinds of failed states that imprison their own people in that particular way. I can only speak for myself. My awareness of it has increased massively in the last 10 years. My sense of what's happening, in a sense, to all of us. Every one of us has become more aware of it. Every one of us has become alive to it because it's on our doorstep now and it's not going to go away. But I also think that the outer is always related to the inner. And I rather suspect that I am a writer who would write about these things anyway because of a sense of his own distance and alienated placement in society. I think that all my earlier existential concerns from the 1960s have shifted and flowed until my own sense of being imprisoned is bound up with the imprisonment that we see outside ourselves. So the inner and the outer are completely linked. I think we might often be trying to escape from one to the other. It's hard to know how to answer this one because it's deliberate in the sense that I always write about where I am. I don't seem to be able to separate myself from my environment, which is another way of being imprisoned, of course. London is the most astonishing place. When you live there, you can't avoid it. It presses in on you. It certainly presses in on me. And very early on, when I lived in London in the mid to late 60s, I had to find a way of dealing with that. And writing turned out to be the way. If I wrote it down, the pressure on me lessened. Whenever I'm in London, I can feel 7 million people around me. I can feel it. I live in Shropshire now, and I still find Shropshire a little bit overcrowded. In fact, I think I would find an empty moor in the middle of the week, in the rain, in the winter, a little bit overcrowded. There's a story about Yorkshiremen who meet on a moor in the middle of nowhere. And they can see one another for miles, and they slowly walk to one another. And as they cross, one of them says to the other, "How do?" And that's it. They're alone on the moor. For me, I kind of prefer to be on the moor. So London is a problem for me, and I handled it by writing about it. Back in the 70s and the 80s, London was a prime site for psychogeography, for hauntology, for ruin porn, for edgelands, for all of that, which had no name back in the 70s. We didn't know what we were doing. We had nothing to call it. And so it was a fine subject in that way. And against it, I would put the interactions of completely alienated characters. And I think that's where you get the power in the horror stories that are set in London. Stories like The Inn-Calling from way back. They take their power from placing alienated people inside heavily urbanised circumstances, which are at the same time saturated with the hauntings of the past, as it were. Having said that, I realise that I haven't really said anything new about writing about London, and I think that's the problem. The problem is it's been written about in precisely that way for so many years now that I'm beginning to wonder if it's not actually quite an empty subject matter. Stories always come to me as images to start with, and sometimes a mix of images. And sometimes that mix, the balance in that mix between, say, mimetic, realistic imagery and, for want of a better word, surrealist imagery or SF imagery or fantasy imagery, that comes to me as a given. That comes to me as a kind of, what's the word? Donné. A kind of donné, and that's what I work with, so that I will often write down something which would appear to be a flash fiction of about 800 words, and I will look at it and I will think, there's the basis of a story in there, but at the moment I'm not sure whether this is a synopsis, the beginning, the end, or a bit from the middle. And so I'll put it in a file, and I'll leave it until another bit comes along to join it. And in the case of The Crisis, I wrote a little piece about a guy living on the streets in London, which I actually set in Viriconium, which was an early fantasy city of mine. And after a bit, I looked at it and I thought, this isn't a Viriconium story. This is 30 or 40 years later. And anyway, it would be lying to say that this is a Viriconium story. This is about living in a doorway in London. So I stripped all that out and rewrote it until it was a lot more mimetic. And I walked about in the streets for a bit at night, looking at people, and then put it back in the file and walked away because nothing was happening with it. And I didn't think it was sufficient on its own. And then one day I got all the rest of the story, which doesn't really, in a way, fit. And at that point, it became a technical challenge to make the two parts of the story work in together. And also to write it in the second person, which I'd never done. I'd been using the second person in a kind of dialect way, on the blog especially, for a few years. And I remember looking at the blog and thinking, I wonder if you could do that at 4,000 words and make it stick. Because the thing about the second person is it's like the present tense or any other odd, as it were, odd tense for narration. Is it most of the time it doesn't work. It stumbles. It has to be, you can feel the writer messing with it with a screwdriver to get it to work. And the second person is really difficult not to sound stiff and odd and as if it's formalised, which you don't want. The idea was trying to keep it informal, to keep it like that kind of dialect you that you use, when you say, when you're walking along the road, it's that kind of feel to it. So that was the technical exercise. The rest was rage. The rest was pure and simple rage. The rest of it was to write a story which was such an offensive presentation of what was going on in the city at the time. Surreal, but completely offensive, because I was so angry. I was just very, very, very angry. It was kind of a revenge, as it were, but at the same time it was a simple observation of behaviour, because I know a couple of those people, and by God, they are workaholics to a degree. They really would keep going. They would keep going there and try to do business. because that's all they can do. That's the way they see the world. So it was a mix. It was revenge. It was humour. I mean, the whole idea was for it to be funny as well as grotesque. But I had a small heart attack while reading it at one point. It makes me so angry even when I read it. Yeah. I think that story works more as a piece of surrealism than as a fantasy or a science fiction story. There's no fantasies and science fiction stories, they solve themselves in a lot of different ways, but they particularly they have a rationale. They have a rationale which unfolds and explains itself to the reader, whereas this one doesn't. You know, where does this come from? Where has this infestation in the city come from? You're told it comes from the astral plane, which is quite obviously a joke. I like the surrealism of it. Way back in the 70s, I wanted to write a novel which would be constructed out of short story-sized glimpses from lots of different points of view of a hitherto undiscovered continent which had appeared on the planet without ever saying that, without ever once again explaining that was what was happening. I tried to write it for about 2 years and eventually gave up because I realised I was technically inept for that subject matter. I just wasn't clever enough to write it, or patient enough to write it. And all the bits of it got used up. All the bits that I'd written got used up, made into short stories, incorporated into other novels, whatever. And then in about 2004, 2005, the idea seemed to creep into my head again, but in a slightly less technically difficult form. And so I wrote the first of the Autotelia stories, mainly to point out, or not to point out, but mainly to, as it were, notice on behalf of the reader how we pursue our new form of colonialism, or one of our new forms of colonialism, how we use tourism and labour to manage our new empire. But I didn't want that to be in your face as you read the story. I also wanted to write the story so that it assumed completely its own rationale, so that the reader would really have to run in a way to keep up with what the situation was, what the political situation was, what had happened in the world. Even the way you get to Autotelia is a bit odd. You get on a train and then suddenly the train flips and it's in another place altogether. But again, I also was fascinated by the character who I had once met on a train in similar circumstances, and had quite a long, interesting conversation with on a journey to Manchester, in fact, from London. And I wanted to write a story in which the character revealed herself without knowing it, in a situation where she believed that the other central character was revealing himself to her without knowing that he was doing so, because people often think that about other people. Mostly I wanted to reinstate, as it were. When you write about exoticism and how it's now exploited or how it's now perceived, I think one of the best ways you can do that is to reinstate it, is to show it happening, is to make the exotic, as it were, and then carefully deconstruct that shave off the superficials until the reader sees that that's what's happening. So it was about that as well. I think that fantasy is brilliant for talking about exoticism, Orientalism. It's the best mechanism you could possibly have for constantly pulling the changes, revealing. I don't think you can support an act of fantasy or science fiction or horror without having the most rigid, without having the strongest possible mimetic, realistic base. Simply because the horrific exists solely in the interplay between the non-horrific and the horrific. The horrific doesn't exist until it's in an interplay with the real. The same goes for the fantastic. It cannot exist on its own. Even in a story where it appears to exist on its own, the interplay is between the story, the fantasy in the story, and the reader's reality. Fantasy is a distinction. It's not really a mode of fiction. It's a distinction, and it's a false distinction, but it's a distinction we've probably had for 300,000 years. I remain fascinated by it. I don't think you can, but I also don't think, and I think this is really important, and I think it's been long lost, because nowadays most fantasy sucks you into a constructed world and is completely immersive. The idea of modern fantasy is to pull you into something that isn't there and keep you there and pretend that it's real. Because of that, to me, it has absolutely no interest whatsoever. Whereas Arthur Machen, or W.B. Yeats, or Charles Williams, or any of the early fantasy writers, they wouldn't move on the fantastic part of the story until they'd established the real. So for me, that's what I do. What I've always done is try and establish the real and then move from there to the edge of the fantasy. I very rarely tip over. I don't like immersive fantasy. I don't like the act of immersive fantasy. You can't do anything with it. It's like television. It's like watching a television. It's not like being alive in a real world. The use of fantasy, and it has its uses, the use of science fiction, which is a form of fantasy, the use of horror and supernatural fiction, is that they're to do with the dialogue between what for the sake of argument we will call the real and what for the sake of argument we will call the fantastic. And without that dialogue, I don't see the point of doing fantasy. The thing about world building is that, yes, of course, every writer does it. Even the most mimetic, even the most realistic writer builds a world. Catherine Mansfield did very little more than build a world. She could write an entire short story by building the world of the characters. Virginia Woolf was good at that too. Yes, we all do it. But there's a difference between building a world the way a Japanese artist builds a world in like 2 or 3 strokes, and this astonishing attempt to detail every single fact in an invented world, which I think even Borges, as early as, the 1950s, was pointing out that essentially, if you wrote like that, you would have to write the universe. You would have to simply rebuild it in another place. You can't do that. That's not what words do. That's not what fiction does. That's not what any kind of writing does. It doesn't produce it doesn't even produce a massively detailed map of the world. Words are too vague to do that. The amount of information words carry is tiny. I think this, to a degree, this goes back to what I was just saying about in the end, fantasy and reality exist only as oppositions. And so if you pull apart the two halves of the opposition, there's a point at which the whole lot will fall over. There's a point at which somehow the fantasy ceases to be a simile for the real world, and the real world ceases to be a simile for the fantasy. And what you're looking for, what I'm looking for, is that moment where you know that if you go one sentence further, the whole lot will collapse. Your metaphor will go, all your analogies will fall to pieces, the world won't stand up, and what you want is to be on that edge, because I think that when you get to that edge, you can see something about the nature of the relationship between fantasy and not fantasy, as it were. That's my rationale at the moment for that. But I also don't think... I think the situation should remain confused. In a sense, we have so much theory now that we're at risk of explaining away how or what fantasy is. Whether this is wish fulfillment or sort of nostalgia, I seem to feel as if there was a state during which earlier writers of what you might call fantasy were, as it were, less professional. They were less professional at it. They didn't have a language for what they were doing. They understood the difference between dreaming and wish fulfillment. They understood the difference between dreaming in a Freudian sense and dreaming in the aspirational Tory sense. They didn't have so many constraints in terms of how they thought of what they were doing. They were not so conscious of writing fantasy. And if you read Walter de la Mare, there are whole stories in which it's two words that do the fantasy. You can't do that now. I get manuscripts sent back to me even now with effectively an editor's response written across the top, which goes, not great, but not enough fantasy. And yet at the end of the story, the world has tipped from the real into something completely unreal. And yet that's not enough fantasy. And I find that really difficult to deal with. Fantasy is it's an event, it's a mode, it's something that you can use 4,000 words to switch it on in the last sentence, and it will still burn. I think that's why I'd rather stay in that liminal area and push it out until it's trembling with the effort of holding itself together, basically. It's a really interesting question. Fiction's episodic, whether it's a very short story or a very long novel. It's episodic. Any part of a novel is essentially a short story. It's an episode, or it contains episodes arranged into a kind of over-episode. I didn't get on with structure until I started reading the modernist short story. I jumped very quickly from Chekhov to Catherine Mansfield, and then from Mansfield into the epiphanic modernist writers of short stories. And I found the epiphanic short story just like it was a total release. You don't have to have a plot here. You don't have to have a narrative. You can manage a movement in the story by revealing the shape of a cupboard at the right point. And that changed my whole relationship to structure, to characterization, to everything in fiction. And then, after I'd been doing that for about 5 or 6 years, and moving it towards what we've already talked about in the use of fantasy and the gap between fantasy and reality, I suddenly realised that if it was true that all fiction was in a sense made up of episodes, then you could construct novels out of episodes that were epiphanic short stories, and that you could do the opposite, that you could take anything out of a novel and with a few twists here and there turn it into an epiphanic short story. All this sounds sort of as if I was only interested in technique. I wasn't. The whole idea of that was that it was a kind of freedom to write in large or small movements which had nothing to do with plot. That they would still move forward, as it were, or forward in quote marks, but that they wouldn't be powered by this appalling, formalistic, Hollywoodized idea of plot, where causality, a kind of, how can you put it? A kind of evident causality has to be behind every shift in the story. I suddenly thought, well, you don't have to do that, because what happens here is what happens here. What I present to the reader is what happens here. In a sense, I leave the reader to put the causality in. Well, it's not so much that I would provide it, it's that what's expected, what you're expected to provide, I think, as a writer, especially now, especially in the contemporary professional situation, is that you have to provide an evident causality for every event in the story, and it has to be plotted in such a way that the classic example for me is that in an Agatha Christie type of mystery, you will often get the detective, when he explains in the last chapter what has happened, say to his assistant, yes, you see, Soames, the Colonel could not have done this murder, because as we know, the murderer wore brown shoes. Colonel Soames would never wear brown shoes on a Sunday. And you look at that and you think, go home. Why? Who cares? This kind of, there has to be a reason for everything. It has to be visible and it has to be in the reader's face all the time. I can't write like that. In a way, I want you to be confused about the kind of shoes that Colonel Soames wore, or whether he was in the graveyard at all that night, I'd rather write a mystery that has no solution than solve a mystery on behalf of the reader up front with a load of... Hollywood version of Freud is that, you did the murders because you hate cows because a cow trod on your foot when you were 7. That's the kind of causality I'm talking about. It's kind of, you don't want to live with that. I had that when I was 7 myself. My parents watched television all day, or for as long as you could in those days. And it was always this kind of Hollywood formalist bad fiction. And the nausea that I felt even when I was 7 at being told that this was why the murderer had acted the way he did was kind of like, so what? Show me something new, show me something more complicated. Make me question what I think about the world. Sometimes I start with the last paragraph. There's a short story in the collection called Animals. No, it's not the one called Animals. Dog People. There's a short story called Dog People. The last paragraph of Dog People, which is weird, especially in the way it is clipped onto the story itself. I started with that and wrote towards it. But it can happen the other way. It can happen, that I'll have a rough idea of where I'm going. and then suddenly in the last 800 words or so, the light bulb will go on, and I'll go, that's why I said that, that's why I'm doing that. Or it could be a combination of the two, really. I love the fluidity of that, because again, if you accept the description of writing that I made earlier, you can always interfere, you can always change, you can always manufacture an epiphany. I think it's a combination of oneself with, this is very hard to express, because you know something about escapism, because you have a position on it, doesn't mean that you don't do it yourself. I saw that scene. I drove past those people on the motorway. I was sitting in the front passenger seat. It was a traffic jam, so there was enough time to actually write it down. And it came to me as a single paragraph with exactly that conclusion attached to it, on its own, as that. And at the time, I felt this incredible mixture of things about who they might be as a family, how relevant that image as a metaphor was to all of our experience in that specific situation, but also metaphorically. And at the same time, I was aware of my own. It was impossible for me to have these thoughts about that without being myself, as it were, an escapist, which I believe us all to be at this point of the 21st century in the developed world. That we can't now not somehow be that. We don't have the option. We've lost the real. Indeed, we take the piss out of the real a lot of the time. We say we've substituted, for instance, the built environment for the real world, for the actual raining, snowing, sunny world. And we laugh at anyone who thinks that there's some kind of authentic reality. We're in a condition of constant philosophical escape. We live for things which are not real. They really aren't, and they weren't even real in 1950. The speed with which this kind of... I've forgotten what Baudrillard's word for it is. What's Baudrillard's description? Never mind. What is the word? Anyway, we've brought it to such a degree, this secondary world that we've made, that really it seems to me that when you talk about fantasy novels, you shouldn't talk about secondary worlds at all. You should be talking about tertiary and quaternary worlds, because we already live in one, basically. I think that fiction for me now, and certainly even as early as 30 years ago, was solely about this almost ontological idea to do with what reality might be, and therefore what a constructed reality might be, and to the degree to which we have forgotten how to tell one from the other, and how that suits a lot of other people. I mean, it suits manufacturers, it suits corporates that we be like that. I don't think that... I know a lot of people who believe that the writing of fantasy is somehow a rejection of corporatism. I don't think it is at all. I think it's an extension of brand formation. I have myself been invited on a couple of occasions to go and talk to brand managers, to be paid a lot of money to tell them how they can use fantasy to do their thing. I might say, turned it down on both occasions, since I thought they were doing a good enough job of it already without my help. And because, as I said to the second person who asked me to do it, I see my job is to subvert that, not to take part in it. And I think that's why a lot of my stories are deliberately broken. Fantasies are always complete, and they always sell you something, and that's complete too, whereas you don't get that with a story of mine.